Hello, everyone. It is Monday, June 7th, and welcome to Status Check with Spivey, where we talk about life, law school, admissions, a little bit of everything. I'm Mike Spivey, the founder of Spivey Consulting Group, and today we are most fortunate to have Dr. Kristin Neff joining us. Dr. Neff is, in my mind at least, and likely objectively, the pioneer in the research on self-compassion. She's the creator of the self-compassion scales. She has written 2 books on the topic, including one that's going to be released June 15th, Fierce Self-Compassion, How Women Can Harness Kindness to Speak Up, Claim Their Power, and Thrive. Her other book is Self-Compassion, The Proven Power of Being Kind to Yourself. Dr. Neff received her doctoral degree from the University of California at Berkeley. She is currently an associate professor of educational psychology at the University of Texas, Austin. I'm not going to go into too much what we're going to talk about, but I will say this. I am fascinated with the concept of self-compassion for the following reason. It deviates a little bit from something you've heard your entire life, which is self-esteem is good. Where I find self-compassion probably a more sustainable, attainable intervention, for lack of a better word, is I think for most, including myself, but almost for most all of us, self-esteem is much more conditionally based. Someone compliments us, we feel good. We hit a goal, we feel good. There may even be evolutionary reasons for that, which we'll just hopefully discuss a little bit with Dr. Neff. But that's all conditional. Someone who matters to you doesn't compliment you, you don't feel good. Self-compassion, there's evidence, I believe, that Dr. Neff has uncovered in her research, much more programmed into us from an early age, much easier if we're going to be compassionate to others to also be compassionate to ourselves. There is fascinating data here on test taking and self-compassion interventions. We'll get into all of that. So without further delay, let me hand it over. And here's Dr. Neff. So I am joined with Dr. Kristin Neff. And if you don't mind, Dr. Neff, can I jump right in from our last podcast that I think is relevant to start off this one?
Absolutely.
We were interviewing Dr. Gabor Mate, and it didn't come up in the interview, but in his book, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, he mentions you see the 55-year-old addict on the street corner, and they're homeless and disheveled, and people may have contempt for that person or pity for that person or say there's a moralless human. But if they were to see the child in that person, the trauma that the child endured, that had them need to numb the pain, they would feel compassion. Right. What's so interesting to me is my takeaway, having listened to your TEDx talk, listened to multiple of your talks, and read a lot of your research, is what you're saying, and please correct me if I'm wrong. Yes, we have that ability for compassion for others in us, probably from an early age. And if we have that ability, then we probably have the ability to turn it inward and feel compassion for ourselves. And I'm going to jump off and hear if I'm right or wrong on that.
Yeah, no, that's right. And so in a way, it's not as natural, right? So the care system evolved primarily to care for others, right? So parents were motivated to care for their infants, and those infants who are more cared for, they pass down their DNA, et cetera. So the care system is generally used to care for others, and it comes pretty naturally for us. For ourselves, we're more likely to fall into the threat defense system, the fight, flight, or freeze response, right? Which is why we tend to be so self-critical, because if there's a problem with us, we attack ourselves thinking that somehow we're going to control the threat, right? We'll be able to get it all together so we won't be in danger anymore. Of course, it doesn't work. Usually self-criticism just makes us more depressed, undermines our motivation, doesn't really help us very well at all. But we think it does. And so what we're doing with self-compassion is we're just making this U-turn. You might say it's like a system hack, where you're using the system that was designed to care for others, and we're using it with ourselves. And the good news is it's not rocket science. We already have the template for care in place, usually developed with close friends or family. So we just have to give ourselves permission to use this kind, caring, warm response with ourselves. And it feels a little weird at first, but you get used to it. It's only because calling ourselves names feels more natural, but once we get used to it, it definitely can be learned. It's a learnable skill, and it makes a huge difference in our ability to cope and our ability to be motivated, to be mentally well, healthy. It's really worth taking that little bit of effort to make that U-turn.
The calling ourselves names is fascinating to me because you can see a scenario where that might help in some areas. I heard you on Dr. Atiya's The Drive, and you mentioned, and we'll talk about this. Our listeners, I think you know this, are mostly college students, people aged 20 to 30, 18 to 30. We once admitted a 12-year-old, so maybe even 12 to 30. But on that vocabulary, there were, I think, sort of a baseline intervention of nothing, and then two interventions, a self-esteem talk and a self-compassion talk.
So that's a study out of UC Berkeley by Juliana Briones and Serena Chen. But there's been other studies similar, right? So we have two ways of researching self-compassion, or a few ways actually. One is just the self-report scale. It's not as convincing as experimental evidence. So this is one of the really first good experimental studies. What they did, and these two researchers were at Berkeley, they had students, all students take a very difficult vocabulary test that everyone failed on. And they had three conditions. One condition, people were told to be self-compassionate, don't beat yourself up. It's common, and try to be kind to yourself. One condition, they gave people a self-esteem boost. Don't worry about it. You must be smart. You got into Berkeley, for goodness sake, right? Self-esteem boost. And the other, they didn't tell anyone, or maybe they had them write about their hobby or something. But so meaning people probably were pretty self-critical, because most people are naturally pretty self-critical. And then what they said is, okay, well, you got a chance to take the vocabulary test again. You can study as long as you want, and you had study materials, and just let us know when you're ready to take the test again. And what they found was that people who are more self-compassionate studied longer for the second exam. And how long they studied was linked to, how well they did on the test. So this is just one of, many examples which shows that when you support yourself, it actually increases your motivation. And by the way, so the condition where they didn't give people instructions, most people probably were criticizing themselves, because that seems to be the default. You can't really ethically it's hard to get it through an IRB to say, call yourself names, right?
Right.
But saying nothing means that most people probably were calling themselves names.
Back when you were getting your PhD, back when I was in my doctoral education, I think IRB was a little different and a little easier.
Yeah.
So now I think the most you can do is say you're average, right?
Right. Yeah. If you want to give people negative feedback, you say your performance was average.
Right.
You can't say you bombed horribly, because it's not okay to be average in our society, right? People have to be above average to feel okay about themselves, which of course is a problem, because it's logically impossible for us all to be above average. And that's really where I differentiate self-compassion from self-esteem. Self-esteem, it's good to feel worthy as opposed to feeling worthless, absolutely. But why do you feel worthy? Do you only feel worthy if you're above average? Do you only feel worthy when everyone likes you? Do you only feel worthy when you're attractive? Do you only feel worthy when you succeed? Which is actually true for most people. Their self-worth is contingent. Whereas self-compassion offers an unconditional source of self-worth. You feel worthy just because you're a flawed human being doing the best you can, like all other flawed human beings. And for that reason, the sense of self-worth associated with self-compassion is much more stable over time.
This is where I get excited. I've become more convinced than ever, having read your work, your research, and some others, but that self-esteem, please tell me if I'm wrong, but for 99.9% of us, barring good moments, I call them liberation moments. I've had them. Usually if I'm trail running in the mountains, I feel like the universe wants me there. But most of the time, it's if someone smiles at me and is friendly to me, or if I hit a goal, that's when I feel the self-esteem. But with self-compassion, it seems like it can be unconditional.
That's the big difference. And also self-esteem is based on like judgment or an evaluation of self-worth. Self-compassion, really, the evaluation doesn't come into it. It is unconditional. Self-esteem is a fair weather friend. Self-compassion is a constant friend. But both are sources of self-worth, because we know psychologically, if you hate yourself, if you think you're worthless, that's a problem for your well-being. And that's what leads people to things like addiction, right? Or unproductive behaviors. But if you feel worthy simply by virtue of being a human being, you talk about a baby, right? We don't say to a newborn baby, yeah, you'll be worthy of care once you get that Ivy League college degree, right? That baby is just intrinsically worthy of care because it's a human being. And we feel that intuitively with the baby. And so we're really taking that approach with ourselves, that we're intrinsically worthy of care and concern and support. And then we're there for ourselves in good times and in bad. sometimes people think that's going to undermine their sense of responsibility. It's like, oh, whatever goes. That's not compassionate. Just like with a child, it wouldn't be compassionate to say, oh yeah, screw up, blow off school, eat all the junk food you want. That's not caring. So when we care about ourselves, we will take responsibility, we'll do healthy behaviors because that's better for us in the long run.
And I believe that there are, on the self-compassion sort of spectra, there's 3 components that go in that are all interrelated, that correlate with one another. Is that accurate?
Yeah, there are 3 components. And one of the reasons it's useful to identify them is because for practicing self-compassion, it's almost like you need these 3 ingredients to bake a loaf of bread. So actually, a lot of the practices intentionally bring in the 3 explicitly. So the first is actually mindfulness, which of course we've heard a lot about, but mindfulness is the ability to be aware of what's happening as it's happening and kind of accept that it is happening. And often we don't want to do that when things are painful, right? Either we do one of 2 things, either ignore it, just kind of stiff upper lip it. And so if you ignore your pain or your struggle, you actually can't give yourself warmth and support for it. It's like if a friend called you up and said, hey, Mike, I've got a problem. I want to talk to you about it. You're like, no, I'm too busy. Then you can't give your friend compassion. On the other hand, we don't want to be fused with the emotions either. If we're lost in it, like lost in the drama of it, that's not healthy either. So with mindfulness gives us perspective. It's like we step outside of ourselves and say, hey, you're having a really hard time. Is there anything I can do to help? I care about you. So mindfulness is the first thing, that kind of being aware of our struggle or feelings of inadequacy, or maybe the pandemic, something we didn't cause, but something that's difficult. We're aware of it in a kind of balanced way with perspective. And then, of course, we need to be kind to ourselves as opposed to harshly judgmental, again, warm, supportive. And sometimes this means constructive criticism or encouragement, like you need to do something different. You need to change your job. You need to change your behavior. This isn't working for you. It's not all acceptance. Acceptance is part of it. We accept ourselves as people, but we don't necessarily accept our behavior or our situations, which actually may be unhealthy. And then really important is the sense of common humanity. So you were talking about the story and before about the homeless person and the difference between pity and compassion. Well, pity, there's a sense of separation. We look down on someone. And with self-pity, there's also a sense of separation. Poor me, woe is me. That's actually not healthy. It's very self-absorbed. Compassion is like, hey, for someone else, it's like, hey, I've been there. Whereas self-compassion, it's like, everyone's been here. In other words, I'm not alone. It's not just me. All human beings are imperfect. All human beings lead an imperfect life. And it's really important to try to remember that consciously, because we just fall into the illusion of thinking it's just us, as if everyone else is leading a normal, perfect life, and somehow I'm abnormal for failing or having a struggle. And that really messes us up, because not only are we struggling, we feel abnormal and all alone, and it makes it a lot worse. So what makes it compassion is that sense of connectedness to others. And it's really one of the most empowering features of self-compassion.
I don't think you like this word. I loved it. You used the word interbeing.
No, I love that word. I thought, so I first learned about self-compassion from Thich Nhat Hanh, who talks a lot about self-compassion. And Thich Nhat Hanh talks about interbeing, which is that we're, all causes and conditions are really part of one large being. I love the word. I just didn't use it because I thought it would make people's heads scratch in academia. So I talk about common humanity. It's kind of easier to access, but what it's really pointing to is something like interbeing. We're all, and not just people, like plants and atoms and everything is all part of one larger whole. That's really where it points to if you take it far enough.
Yeah, when we were in college, we thought we were so clever. We would cite chaos theory all the time.
Right.
But now when I hear you say interbeing, the poem For Whom the Bell Tolls always comes to mind.
Oh, interesting, huh?
None of us are an island unto ourselves.
That's right. But we do forget it. So and that's why it helps explicitly, consciously remember, oh, that's right, I'm not alone. Oh, that's right, it's not just me. And when we do it intentionally, it really strengthens our compassionate response.
I'm a former runner, so I used to be very self-critical if I didn't get the 400-yard dash in 49 seconds. And then maybe there was that short-term bump for something athletic or deadlifting, but probably long-term it's not evolutionarily beneficial.
Right. So again, it's very much like how we motivate our children, right? So harsh corporal punishment, threats, demands, there's short-term compliance, But there's some long-term problems. For instance, it undermines your intrinsic motivation in the long run. It can have you lose faith in yourself. You can become afraid of failure. So all this we know is self-criticism, right? This short-term compliance, it may get you, and some people definitely have gotten through law school or med school or achieved some of the goal through self-criticism. But in the long run, it does undermine your motivation because it makes you afraid of failure, which means it's harder to take risks. The really, really big problem is that it undermines your ability to learn from your failure. So in order to really look at our failure and learn from it, we need to kind of have an open mindset. We need to say, hey, it's okay, everyone fails. What can I learn from this? But if instead you're just wallowing in shame or I'm such a failure, it's going to make it more complicated for you to look. In fact, maybe if you don't even want to look, maybe you want to blame someone else if you can get away with it. So the research shows pretty clearly that self-compassion is a more effective motivator than self-criticism. And of course, it makes sense. Imagine if you're, again, trying to motivate your friend or your child. If you just say, you stupid dummy, like how effective is that going to be? But if you say, hey, I believe in you. How can I help you? You can do it. I've got your back. I'm here to support you. Clearly, that's going to be more effective.
Let's say you're talking to your friend the day of the second vocab test. So you gave yourself a self-compassionate talk 2 weeks ago. You studied harder. But the morning of, has there been any research into what would be the stronger sort of inputs for that day? In other words, hey, you got this. You're super cool. I'm actually quoting Reservoir Dogs by Quentin Tarantino. Right. That's what the actor said in the mirror right before their big bank heist. You're super cool. You got this. Has there been any study into that sort of day of what talk would be more beneficial?
I don't think in terms of longitudinally, but there's been a lot of studies of in the moment, like, so in terms of state self-esteem. So mostly, and in fact, the study out of Berkeley, when they did it just after talking to themselves, they gave them, so we compared the people who got the self-esteem boost, the self-compassion boost, or nothing, which is probably self-criticism. And then they studied right away. So there's nothing that's really specifically at when it's most useful, but most of the studies actually are done day of, right at the time.
Okay.
So it seems to be the mindset you want to be in to be best. And by the way, what you're talking about that, you got this, you're super cool, that's like a positive affirmation. Self-compassion is different than positive affirmations. They find that positive affirmations, you're super cool, you're brilliant, every day and everyone getting stronger and stronger. They actually only work for people who already have high self-esteem. For people who doubt themselves, it actually makes things worse because they think, I don't believe that.
Right.
The self-compassion isn't positive affirmations, right? It's kind of saying, okay, well, you're a flawed human being, and it's okay to be a flawed human being. And I believe in you, I'm going to support you. But the bottom line is if you don't got this, in other words, if you fail, that's okay too. So it doesn't clash with reality. It's not sugarcoating. It's actually opening to the fact that, hey, I'm a flawed human being. Everyone's a flawed human being. I'm just going to do my best.
I was in my late 20s when I saw it. I went and said to myself in the mirror, hey, Mike, you're super cool. I didn't believe myself for a second.
How funny.
So everything you say is relatable. I'm curious. So to me, the crux of the issue is that, again, on any given day, any one of us can wake up feeling great. So-and-so partner says to us something slightly negative. In some cases, a stranger just scowls at you walking by them in the office building or whatever. Mm-hmm. We've all experienced that. Why is that person mad at me? Now, they're probably 99% likely in their own head and not mad at you, but that's not how we internalize. Right. Yeah. So self-esteem is just ephemeral. And self-compassion, to me, it just seems so much more sustainable. And I think that's what your research shows.
Yeah. I did one study where we measured people's state self-worth, like how were they feeling today? We measured, I think, 12 times over an 8-month period. And what we found is that global trait levels of self-compassion predicted stability, but global levels of self-esteem didn't. In other words, you might, in a self-report scale, score really high in self-esteem, but it may be unstable. It goes up and down depending on, usually the 3 most common domains is what other people think of me. And again, it's not like what my friends and my mom thinks of me. It's like what other people, that stranger on the street or people at work, people on Facebook. It's very vague, lousy information. Or it's a success and valued domains, whether it's work or athletics or whatever it is you care about. And also perceived attractiveness. And for women especially, this is, believe it or not, the number one domain in which women invest their self-esteem. So for instance, we did We did a study where we had women who were with negative body image. They just listened to the meditations on my website for 3 weeks. And at the end of the 3 weeks, their sense of self-worth was less contingent on their perceived attractiveness, which kind of shows you the power of self-compassion.
Yeah. And you have a book coming out, I believe, June 15th.
Yes.
Your Self-Compassion.
Fierce self-compassion, how women can harness kindness to speak up, claim their power, and thrive.
I'm acutely interested in reading it, particularly because I think it's, even though there's a focus on women, there's probably another book out there that would focus on where men lack.
Yeah, I'm trying to get my colleague Chris Grimmer to write that one because I don't have a lot of experience as a man. So I felt it would have been presumptuous of me to write the book for men. But the basic principles apply to everyone. The idea is there's two sides of self-compassion. There's the tender side, which most people think of as like the accepting, warm, unconditionally accepting side of ourselves. But then there's also the fierce side, right? And this has to do with either our behaviors or our situation. In order to care for ourselves, sometimes we need to say no to people. If someone's treating us unjustly or crossing our boundaries, the self-compassionate thing to do sometimes is to get angry. It's like, no, that's not okay, right? So it has a lot of kind of the action-oriented side of self-compassion, or a motivating change is part of fierce self-compassion, right? It's not just about acceptance. It's also changing behaviors or situations that are harmful. And then also meeting our own needs, right? Actually saying, I would really love to help you, Mike, but I'm sorry, this is important to me. I need to do this, right? So saying no to others and saying yes to ourselves. Actually, because of traditional gender role socialization, what we find is that men are more okay with being fierce, like they're told that they're entitled to meet their needs and, it's okay for them to be angry and all these things. They have a little more time being tender because, boys are called names if they're too sensitive, which harms men because it robs them of this incredibly important resource of self-compassion to, accept ourselves, especially when things are difficult. Whereas women, on the other hand, are socialized not to be too fierce, right? We're supposed to be just self-sacrificing. We're supposed to meet other people's needs. We aren't supposed to get angry. It's kind of more of a, people are valued for being soft and gentle and yielding. So I wrote the book for women because of that. The book would have to be a little different for men, but I have a lot of exercises in there for both fierce and tender self-compassion. And really, really important is balance. Because if you're too tender and not fierce enough, you may become complacent, right? But if you're too fierce and not tender enough, you may be aggressive or hostile. So we need both energies. It's kind of like yin and yang. We need both for health and well-being. But unfortunately, traditional gender role socialization often interferes with our ability to attain balance. So that's kind of what the book is about.
And it's okay if I read it when I get back, when I'm traveling right now.
Absolutely.
I look forward to it. Is there anything, Dr. Neff, that you think would be value added that I didn't ask you about as far as our listeners, who again are generally college students or graduate school students, and maybe even social media, something we didn't touch on? I feel like the world in this interbeing type state, we are more connected than ever, but that also gives more opportunities to be bullied, to feel compromised by others than ever, or compare ourselves.
Yeah. I mean, in many ways, social media, I think in and of itself is neutral. It can be used for connection, technology. But unfortunately, what occurs more often, especially with things like Instagram, is people project this sense of perfection, right? They put filters on themselves. They don't use the shot that shows anything bad. And that actually increases that sense of isolation. Like fear of missing out, oh, I'm not having fun, or I don't look that way. So that often, as you say, increases that sense of isolation. It increases the self-esteem pressure, which is a problem, right? Thinking that, I can't keep up with them. They're more cool than I. It's only me who looks this way or is having these struggles. And so I think it really is necessary for everyone, but especially for young people, because that age of life, there's so much pressure to achieve, to prove yourself, right? And I think people fall into the illusion of thinking that I need to be hard on myself. I need to drive myself so I can get ahead in life. Where in fact, what the research shows is you're more likely to get ahead if you support yourself. Doesn't mean being lazy. Your standards can still be high. You can still shoot to be the best. But if you can trust that if you fail to meet your goals, instead of shaming yourself, which is actually going to undermine you, that you will support yourself. Okay, I failed. Well, everyone fails. What can I learn from this failure? How can I help myself achieve my goals? That's actually going to be much more effective in the long run.
and more reliable than getting support in a sense than from any other source.
That's right. And so, yeah, it's great when you have friends or if you happen to have a relationship partner or a good family, but you don't want to be dependent on that because they may or may not be available. Or sometimes you have really supportive friends or a partner and you don't even listen to it because you're so full of your own self, hatred. So you really need to include yourself. You really need to practice this and to put yourself in this really positive, healthy mindset that will allow you to tackle the challenges in life. And again, the research really, there's over, I think, 3,700 studies now that shows that self-compassion helps you cope with the tough stuff. Even just the pandemic, research showed that people who had more self-compassion were better able to get through the pandemic. So it's something that we all need. And it's not rocket science, and it is a practice. And like, you can go to my website at selfcompassion.org and you can find practices. I've got books. I mean, there's a whole technology laid out of how to do it. And again, it's not that difficult. You just need to choose to try to do something different.
Just as simple as putting your hand on your heart.
And just saying, what would I say to a good friend I cared about in this situation to support them? And then would I say what I'm saying now? Probably not. Okay,
Right.
then what would I say? And then you just try it out. And it feels a little weird at first. Like I say, it's maybe not natural. And evolutionarily, our care system tended to evolve for other people. So it feels a little odd at first, but you get used to it. And then eventually the benefits are really powerful.
I feel like these have been very stressful times. I hate the word perfect storm. So I always say atmospherically conditional stressful times. Yeah. So we've had you on this podcast and Dr. Mate and Dr. Winch, and we hope to have some more because your advice, your research, your counsel here is just so appreciated. What you've said in your talks and some of the podcasts I've listened to has helped me personally. And I think it's going to be very beneficial to the people who listen to this one. So thank you, Dr. Neff.
Thank you. I hope so. Thank you, Mike. Thanks for having me on.